Ecclesiastes chapter 4. We'll be picking up there. Thank you, Stephen, for teaching on Wednesday. And we'll kind of bring ourselves back from where we started in chapter 3 to where we are in chapter 4. Remember that this is just building on itself, and we have a lot of counterpoint as it relates to wisdom, and what we might even say is kind of anti-wisdom, but ultimately wisdom itself, as it is giving the other side of the coin from Proverbs. As we get started, I would remind us that we have been dealing with this book, Ecclesiastes, from the perspective of Solomon, but he is playing a certain role in this book. What does the word Ecclesiastes mean? Preacher, and that is the role that Solomon is playing. He is the preacher. Remember that Ecclesiastes kind of sounds like ecclesia, which is the word for church, and so assembly, so it's the person who speaks to the assembly. So Ecclesiastes, we are viewing Solomon as one who is taking the observations that he has seen under the sun, and then how he is applying wisdom, but then he is going beyond just a human or worldly wisdom to try and that he is trying to point people to God. He is playing the role of the speaker to the assembly. He is playing the role of a preacher. And in chapter 3, we had this poem about the various times, and we suggested that this demonstrates the sovereignty of God, is that God is appointing everything, that everything is becoming beautiful in its time according to what God is determining, and that he has a purpose. It is to show the limitations of humanity so that we would then ultimately turn to him and fear him. As we moved beyond that, Wednesday, Stephen talked about faith and experience, about how you will sometimes see oppression, how you'll sometimes note difficulties, and ultimately it's going to take that beyond the under the sun perspective that is going to be able to allow you to traverse those difficulties. And I want us to continue that line of thinking that he brought up on Wednesday, from that experience into a balanced perspective that is offered through wisdom that is built on the fear of God. And so as we begin, I bring up the outline. Once again, we're still, I believe, in the observations, and then he's beginning to apply some wisdom and piety to this, and seeking balance in a disordered world is how I'm labeling chapter 4, verses 4 through 16. We're going to return to the idea of labor here, and I would suggest that what we have here is the futility of wicked labor. And I know that sometimes whenever you apply a title, it is somewhat painting with a broad brush. There's going to be some nuance to this, but I do think that he does bring up some ideas that are associated with people who don't fear God, who are trying to labor under the sun apart from God. Some of this is what it's going to look like. So let's begin with chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. We'll read through it. We'll talk about question number 1 in the handout, and then we'll kind of step back and get into some of the more specifics in this part. It says, "Then I saw all the labor and all the skill of the work. Truly, it is only the jealousy of one man against his neighbor. This also is vanity and striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his flesh. Better is a palmful with rest than 2 handfuls with labor and striving after wind." All right, I'm going to have the question come up later. I forgot to put it here, so you might have to look in your worksheet if you need to. But question number 1 says, what vice motivates many people to work, and what advice does Solomon offer to laborers?
Advising don't work to impress others, to show off, keep up with the Joneses, or keep ahead of the Joneses. Because work like that it leads to turmoil of the mind and in your life. It's better to have a little and be at peace than it is to have a lot and be in constant pain and turmoil.
Very good. Any other thoughts? All right, so I want us to begin with that idea of kind of as Tony put it, keeping up with the Joneses. I think most translations are going to say envy or jealousy in this section. That is, it is only the jealousy of one man against his neighbor. There are other ways of viewing this. What's another English word for the Bible word jealousy? Does anyone know? Zealous, zeal. And so this could be interpreted as he saw all the labor, and it is the zeal of one man in comparison to his neighbor. And so the reason I say there are multiple ways of interpreting this is, one, do you view this as a envious against, or do you view this as more zealous than the lazy man who is your neighbor? And both, I think, could fit into the context, because we're going to have the fool resting his hands in just a little bit. However, I do tend to think that as he is looking around and viewing the world, he is seeing this kind of antagonistic relationship between the neighbors, between the companions. And he is saying, if you work and work and work merely because you are comparing yourself with and to your neighbor, then it's going to lead to futility in that labor. I don't watch Hallmark movies, but it just seems like this would be the storyline of a Hallmark movie, as someone who is trying to constantly be better than neighbor until the final resolution of, oh, it's not really all about this. So you got to throw a love story somewhere in there, I'm sure. But the picture of the jealousy of one man against his neighbor, he can say, this is vanity and striving after the wind. Why would that be vain? Jealousy, envy against a neighbor is the only purpose of labor.
No matter how successful you become in comparison to your neighbor, someone else will still be yet more successful. And then even then, the measure you're using, as it shows in the end, is going to be ultimately empty. So what have you won?
Yeah, there's always going to be someone better. Now, this reminds me, actually, I'm a 90s kid, and so I actually watched this show called Recess, which was a animated film that was based on Hogan's Heroes. So I did watch Hogan's Heroes on reruns as well, but that was way before my time. And there was an episode where the moral of the story is there's always someone better, so even their best sports player couldn't beat this player, and so on and so forth, and all the smart people couldn't be smart. And the story was, here is someone who was always better than anyone else. And the moral of the story was he didn't like being better than everyone else. And so even if you could get to a point where there was no one better than you, it ultimately winds up being vain. But here he is saying, you start comparing, and there's always going to be the next neighbor. You're going to be moving up the ladder and finding, there's someone better, there's someone smarter, there's someone richer. And so you're constantly in this state of envy if that's your measure. And so it's not going to bring meaning to your life. Bryce?
I think it's also talking about here, though, that striving to be that way, to make your neighbor jealous of you because you've got more or what have you, you're never going to find rest with that kind of mentality. And it's pointing out that it's better to have balance in that you do work and strive hard, but you also have the time to enjoy some rest from that work.
Yeah, we'll come back to that idea of finding the contentment, but good point about the mutual jealousy, or however you want to phrase that. Any other thoughts?
The legacy has it that every labor and every success of the work is the result of jealousy. And I think that's a concept that, people like Ayn Rand and so forth have sort of posited greed and avarice as a virtue, when we just look at all the things that it produces. And so I think, there's maybe a healthy competition, but there's certainly this sort of competition that may produce lots of innovations. But if this is at the root of them, then the result is still going to be degradation culturally and of the people that are involved in it.
It reminds me of a story I heard in the last couple of months about the whole AI race and between various countries. And it's not necessarily that as I understand from the story, that the American developers, I'm sure they have their own vices that they're dealing with greed and seeking success. But part of it was, we can't let China get beyond us. And so we are just pushing the envelope because we cannot allow this other one to be farther than us, because then we would, there could be detrimental world issues. But is how they're framing it. But do you notice how empty that really sounds? Is that it's only about making sure we don't get at the disadvantage. And so I'm not trying to suggest that I know anything about the politics of world competition, but Solomon would look at something like this and say, striving after the wind. It's empty. It's going to lead to nothing ultimately. Any other thoughts?
Well, I don't know if you were going to talk about verse 5. Seems to be the other end of that spectrum, which is the person who is lazy and just won't work, and he almost starves because he's consuming his own flesh because he won't put his hand to the wheel to work.
That's a good segue, because I did want to go from envy to laziness, and this sounds somewhat proverbial, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like the Proverbs. You can translate this into English as either flesh or meat, sustenance, however you want. And so there's one way of looking at this that says, the fool folds his hands and it is destroying himself. He's eating his own flesh. The other way to look at this is, the fool folds his hands, and even though this other person is working and working and working, he gets all the meat that he wants, the fool does. And so maybe it's kind of a counter to what you would think of the fool shouldn't get anything. And yet sometimes the fool winds up getting everything, or the meat that everyone would be looking for. Just as kind of a side note related to that, especially in this culture, you see the blessing of God providing meat to them in the wilderness. When you get to the land of Canaan, why is it always daily bread and those kinds of things? It's because often for especially your lower class citizens, the only time you got meat was in the fellowship meals in the sacrifices. And so it was something very special to receive meat. And so if this is talking about meat, it's the fool just folds his hands and he is getting kind of the prime food that anyone could receive. But you have left it there ambiguous as eats his flesh, because that gives you both options as to what it might be saying. But either way, we have the vice of envy in the first part, the vice of laziness in the second part, and both are destructive to relationships or to one's own person. Any other thoughts? All right, then the last part is, here is some wisdom. And again, this sounds like the Proverbs, doesn't it? Better this than that. So better is a palmful with rest than 2 handfuls with labor and striving after wind. Now, is Solomon saying here that it is better just to kind of resign yourself to a very little bit so that you don't have to work hard? No. He here or in Proverbs is not saying be lazy. He is not condoning laziness. What is he upholding here in this last part? Moderation and contentment. Very good. Because if you have 2 handfuls with a bunch of labor, and yet it's all striving after the wind, then that is in vain, empty purpose to labor. But if you can work, and even if you don't have as much as everyone else, even if you have 1 palmful instead of 2 handfuls, then he says, at least that means something to you. There is something good about this. There's, as he would tie back to chapter 2, this is a gift from God. And so can you appreciate that? And he is going to develop this a little bit more in verses 7 and 8. But does anybody have any additional comments here in verses 4 through 6? All right, then let's read verses 7 through 8 as he is continuing this idea. And here he is building probably a parable, which I have labeled as working for nothing and no one. And that already, I think, gives the tenor of this passage of how empty this looks. as he is looking under the sun, looking into what he can see, and here's something he sees. He turns or maybe again looks, and here's what he sees. Then I turned and saw vanity under the sun. What was that vanity? There was one person, but there was not a second. He did not even have a son or a brother, but there was not an end to all his labor. Moreover, his eyes were never satisfied with wealth, and he wondered, for whom do I labor and deprive, for whom am I laboring and depriving my soul of good? This also was vanity and a disagreeable task. All right? So, as he is continuing this idea, what's he see here? Describe in everyday terms what he is looking at in this observation.
Somebody who he doesn't have a family, he doesn't even really have a friend that he's helping to provide for, and yet he just seems to work to get all that he can, and for what purpose. He doesn't even seem to be able to enjoy it himself.
Yeah.
So that seems to be the vanity there. Why all this trouble?
So we're a day away from December. There's kind of a famous story by Charles Dickens that kind of sounds a little bit like that. Christmas Carol. This sounds like an Ebenezer, doesn't it? Ironically, you think about the name Ebenezer and the biblical roots of that and where Ebenezer eventually goes in that story. But as he is looking at kind of the early part of that story, a person like that story, he has no one, he's working all the time, and he's getting nothing from it, and he's leaving it for no one. It's a very sad picture, and that's why he'll say vanity and a disagreeable task. So now he's going to be shifting, and we'll come back to some of the descriptions here, but he keeps shifting the terms that he puts together. Vanity and striving after the wind. Here, vanity and a disagreeable task. Why do you think he shifts from striving after the wind in the previous to now disagreeable task? Or whatever your translation may say.
Well, I think here there's no satisfaction whatsoever in all the labor, because it's just like, what am I doing this for?
And it's that labor part that I think is important, is that as he had kind of the motivations of jealousy in the previous section, and it's like you're grasping after the wind there. Here you have someone who is really working hard. It says it's a disagreeable, it's an unenviable task, is that he's working, and he has no one to share it with and nothing to gain from it. And you hear the internal dialogue there of, for whom do I labor? And for whom am I depriving my soul of good? I think it's very important as you read through Ecclesiastes to look for every time you can see that word good. Now, sometimes in English we have to translate it as better, but it's still the word good in Hebrew. I think this is a sub-theme throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. He's looking for what is good for a man under the sun. And here the person is saying, I am depriving myself of something good. Now, he's not giving exactly what that good thing might be, but notice he has all the stuff, and that's not the good. So, and he's got a lot of work to do. That's not the good. So he is recognizing in all of this labor, he's depriving himself of something good. I think we have a hint of what that is. It is what we already saw of contentment, but not only contentment, but companionship. And these are themes that are going to be picked up as we move through.
I was reading an article just this last week about work ethic, the decline of work ethic, and that being an increasing complaint. But the article made the point that in American culture, you've stripped out the two main motivators, which is devotion to God and devotion to family. And both those things being destroyed leave people, you can't hang work ethic on nothing. And so that's, some of what this is getting at here is, why would you keep putting your nose to the grindstone for what? To give to.
Several years ago, I read a book that was it was somewhat religious, but it was also just kind of doing some study of the millennial generation of which I'm a part. And they discovered that in the workplace, millennials would rather not take a pay increase if it left more time for vacation, and they said so that they can be with their family. There was a shift, especially with 9/11 and millennials, that they began to, at least at some level, think more about the relationships. Now, whether or not we have continued with that as the digital age has increased, that's up for grabs. But the idea here is that at least when those surveys were done, they would say, I would take less money if it means I get to spend more time with those whom I love. And I think there is a picture there that the world realizes some things that Solomon has been saying through Ecclesiastes for centuries. It's going to mean nothing if you strip it of the ultimate relationship and the other meaningful relationships underneath that. Any additional thoughts, sir?
One more grasping for the wind type motivation that people, he doesn't exactly address it here, but people who say, well, they don't think I'm going to succeed. Well, I'll show them. I'll show him. In other words, that is my motivation. And that is a strong motivation until it's not. That will fade and that will turn into nothing. And then what do you got? What are you working for then? Some motivations like that just do not last. At the type that we're talking about here, the right motivation will keep you going from day to day.
Very good. All right, and so before we move on to the next verses, I would just point out that in this section, what we have seen is it is empty to work when there's no companionship or help associated with it, when there is no end in sight. It is just a continual cycle, just like we saw in nature in chapter 1, and when it is ultimately unsatisfying. And the world offers very cheap ways of trying to find answers to those problems. They'll say, well, just find satisfaction by, give up everything and go travel for a little while and try to find something that really brings meaning to your life. Now, there's got to be something deeper. There's got to be a better foundation if there is going to be you're going to find any kind of meaning in this. Any final comments or questions there on 7 and 8 before we move on? All right, then let's go on to 9 through 12. 9 through 12. And again, this is going to sound very Proverbs-like. We have another better than statement. It says, better are two than one, because they have a good reward in their labor. For if they fall, the one will raise his companion up. But woe to the one who falls and does not have a second to raise him up. Moreover, if two lie down together, then each of them will be warm. But regarding only one, how will he be warm? How will he get warm? And though someone can overpower one, two can stand against him, and the threefold cord is not quickly snapped. All right. Here I am labeling this as wisdom for disillusioned laborers, because we've seen futility, we've seen disagreeableness. Now he seems to be saying, here is some wisdom in the midst of this labor, and he's tying it back to the idea of companionship. And so question number 2, and I'll come back to the text, or you can keep your Bible open there. Why is companionship better than isolation? Why is companionship better than isolation, from verses 9 through 12? And you can even tie in some of the previous verses.
You have someone to raise you up, and take that to mean not just physically if you fall, but if for whatever you need, you have someone there to build you up, to help you, to encourage you. And it talks about warmth, physical warmth. That can also be taken metaphorically, but there are two are better than one in many ways that he lists here, and others we can take that.
Any other thoughts on that?
Two can also produce more than one, so there's a greater reward
putting those together, in essence, what we're finding is he's saying, in this parable of the person who has no one, no son, no brother, and he's doing all of this work, he's saying, number one, the reason it's good to have two, the reason to prioritize some companionship here is because there is gain, there is a reward. Number two, because there is assistance that can be offered one to the other. He may just be thinking of survival in a sense, and we, in our individualistic society where just about anyone can live apart from others, these may not have as much weight as they did in the original context of it would be very difficult, and in fact it would be somewhat of a shame for someone in that culture to try to be individualistic, to try to be separated from a community or from people. But it may be more than just the survival, as Tony pointed out, that there's kind of an emotional help with one another. There is a closeness and intimacy that allows for helping one another. There is strength in the numbers, and it is more permanent than an individualistic life.
I think like in a lot of these cases, the physical realities were clear then than they are now, but they tied to the metaphorical or spiritual realities. And because the physical realities aren't as clear today, then we also don't recognize the spiritual realities that are still tied to those.
Right. And, when people say things like, well, I have my own relationship with Jesus, I don't really need corporate religion, they've missed the survival aspect of this. For the people in the time of Israel, you needed the community. And for all manner of survival, and if you did something to get yourself cut off from the people of God, cut off from the community, that was a much bigger thing at that time. And so those spiritual realities were grounded in things that they could comprehend. And we need to help people realize you will not survive on your own. That's why God has created a community, created the church, so that it is more than just, here I can get some time of socialization, I can get some time of a little bit of building up. No, this is our group of people who are fighting a battle, who are comrades in arms, and we need each other. And so I think we're having some pictures here, and we need to reinstate those spiritual realities by helping people understand the physical realities as well. Any other thoughts on that?
The story of Ruth has this embedded all the way through, both the physical and then the spiritual aspect of it,
Yeah.
like on one another.
Yeah, and what was God able to accomplish when people were joined in that kind of a communal relationship? He was able to bring David. He was able to bring the Messiah through those kinds of relationships. Any other thoughts on that? Yes, sir.
Don't we have an overall goal to be pleasing to Jesus, and that should motivate us to do well in serving our boss because Colossians talks about work as unto the Lord, So I know we talked about jealousy and things like that, but I guess that's what man does on his own, whereas as Christians we should be motivated to do well in our jobs just as if we're working for the Lord, right?
Very good. And I think you reminded me of something. Think about in the first century with Christians, think about Paul. There are some times when he gets cut off from everyone else, not by his own choice, but most of the time when he is traveling, what does he have? Who does he have with him? He has a whole group of companions. But then whenever he's in prison, probably in the second arrest, if that is the case, then what's he writing to Timothy for?
No, we're almost in one.
I've got almost no one here. I need you to come. Now, it is true that if we are a faithful Christian, having Jesus is all we need. but we also need one another. And so he had Jesus who stood by him the entire time, but he's saying, Timothy, I need you to get here. There was a recognition, even with Paul, who is probably the greatest Christian who ever lived, who needed other people. He needed his spiritual companions to help him. And this at least speaks to that idea, that we cannot be individualistic Christians. It doesn't work. We can be individualistic Americans, and yet, again, pulling in the illustration, a bunch of Hallmark movies have probably been made that say it doesn't really work even for us. But the truth is, you can't make it on your own. And I don't think we need to be ashamed whenever we're trying to encourage people who start drifting to say, you will not survive spiritually without your companions in the faith. And so we need to uphold these principles of these truths about companionship. How does this fit into the overarching context of not just looking at 4:9 through 12, but how does this theme of companionship hit into the overarching letter or work of Ecclesiastes? What are some observations you might make there?
I would say a lot of the vanity stems from an individualistic approach. I mean, just coming back to the competitive aspect, it makes everybody a challenger and instead of a companion. And so it cuts you off in so many ways. And so I think this is a pushback to part of the thing that's causing the vanity. Maybe it calls from the vain approach, but this is a push against the individualism that is an inevitable result of kind of Solomon's approach.
Right.
Maybe too, if he's observing some things that will alleviate or make the vanity easier to bear under the sun, maybe he's also giving us a hint as regards the direction that he's going, because it was in the beginning that God said it's not good for man to be alone. So if we start to recognize, oh, wait a second, there's value to companionship. Wait a second, that design came from God.
And something you said there, any physical reality is also trying to picture a spiritual reality. And I would suggest that God gave us a companion, not just because God gave Adam a companion, not just because it was not good for man to be alone, but he could not fully realize the kind of relationship that is necessary with God apart from some kind of companionship. And so we often talk about the marriage relationship is a picture of our relationship with God. Well, that is true, but even the whole concept of companionship, maybe this is picturing the Trinity in divine communion with one another, the creation of humanity, that to better appreciate our companionship with God, we need to better appreciate the companionship we have on the horizontal level as well. Some additional thoughts here would be that so far what we've been dealing with in the immediate context is injustice, oppression, isolation, and now he says, here's something better. Here's something that can mitigate some of that vanity. Now, I think what he's going to do is offer a counterpoint, and that he's going to say, but even companionship alone is not enough. So it seems like throughout this book he's saying, this. Here's a little bit of wisdom. This would be good for you. This alone doesn't work because of this. And so he talked about the negative pictures of human relationships of, again, injustice, oppression, isolation, and yet he says, here's some wisdom. But he's going to kind of disabuse our minds of the idea that companionship is enough without God. And so companionship is valuable, but it is not going to take away all the instability unless one gets a better picture of who God is. All right? So that leads us to 13 through 16. We're going to finish up here today. And I've labeled this an upside-down world because the wisdom he offers here is going to begin to picture how wisdom is sometimes flipped in this disordered world. And let's read verses 13 through 16. It says, better is a poor and wise boy than an old and foolish king who does not know how to take warning anymore. For he went out from the house of imprisonment to become the king, even though he was born wanting in his kingdom. I saw all the living who were walking around under the sun with the second boy who would stand under him. There was not an end to all the people, to all who were before them. Moreover, the ones coming after them do not rejoice in him. Truly, this is also vanity and striving after the wind. All right, here's why I'm suggesting things are somewhat upside down. In the book of Proverbs, how does it picture the boy, the lad?
Naive at best, foolish at worst.
All right, often foolish, because you get wisdom through experience. Here you have an old king. How is that turned upside down from Proverbs?
Gray hair is wisdom.
Yeah. Being elderly should be associated with wisdom. Now he has and again, wisdom would often lead to productivity. What we have is a poor, wise boy and an old, foolish king. He's turned things upside down. Why? Because wisdom is not necessarily always going to follow the mold in a world that is pushing against that wisdom. And so we have this picture, and he's going to say this is ultimately all vanity. So let me just bring up the question here. What do you think is the point of the parable here? What's he trying to accomplish by following up what he has just said with this parable? Why this wisdom?
You can't just rely on truisms to always play out. And you, no matter what, you still have to examine and not dismiss a boy because he's a boy, not accept an old man because he's an old man. Those differences may be in place, but you still have to look at the reality.
Right. And we're going to come to this a little bit later in another wisdom section of Ecclesiastes, where I think what he is saying is, where is the person who would stand up against the king in his folly? That almost sounds somewhat autobiographical, that maybe this is what Solomon wishes could have happened with him. But regardless, he is saying things are going to shift, and not always in the positive direction in this world. And how do you deal with this? Notice again, we have this perpetual cycle this person came out of poverty to become the king. So he must have had some kind of wisdom that allowed him to take that opportunity and move forward. And yet what's going to happen? He's now become so stagnant and so unwilling to change that now another poor boy is able to take the opportunity and either usurp or just take the next step, and there'll be people following, and ultimately there's not going to be any deference one toward one or the other. There's going to be no change. It's going to continually like this. And so he has a somewhat pessimistic picture here, and he says this is ultimately vanity. We'll spend some time with questions 4 and 5 before we move on to the next section. But he has dealt with wealth, friendship, politics here, and he's going to move into religion next. Thank you for your participation.